my project. Barbara stole a little bit of my thunder, but that's all right. So I was going to say, this is my project. I'm working on many of the chapters on the final report on the early Bronze Forest settlements in Area B at Kiribati-Skander. You know, the nuts and bolts of field reports, everything from typology to Harris matrices and all of that, and I'd like to allay your fears. I'm not going to be throwing Harris matrices at you. Actually, I'm going to be talking about the concluding chapter, working conclusions, I should say. Trying, once again, did it before, as you said, trying once again to situate Kiribati-Skander in the broader southern Levant. But not only that, you know, not just in the southern Levant with other sites, but in the northern and southern Levant, the entire Levant, in light of the new chronology. So if you read my abstract, you know there's a new higher chronology for the early Bronze Age. I'll be talking a lot about it. But while I'm mentioning this, hoping to push forward these publications, excuse my shameless plug for this book and its award, but as Barbara said, I was able to finish this, and it was published in 2010, and this was Area C, our gateway, the early Bronze IV period, as well as the cemetery, so you know, I'm hoping to do this again. I have to mention another project, you know, if you're a scholar, you're working on 10 things at once, but another project of mine that really informs my topic today is this volume I'm editing, New Horizons in the Study of the Early Bronze III and the Early Bronze IV in the Levant, to be published by Eisenbronze. Haven't quite figured out the logo, but basically it's about 25 to 30 articles from an ACOR workshop that I held over 2 years because of this new chronology. So I invited scholars from the north, the northern Levant, and scholars from the south, and we all got together, and it was great. We were talking about the problems, trying to figure out realignments, and I'm going to be talking about that tonight, but it's just a wonderful way of networking and just broadening horizons to work with people who are working in the north. So, so that very much informs this topic. So really, in a nutshell, I guess, I'll be saying more about it later, but what has happened is that the early Bronze chronology for the southern Levant has shifted 200 years. That means it's been pushed back 200 years. Now think about that. Think about the ramifications of that. For example, I'll throw out an absolute date, 2500 BCE. What's happening then? Well, 4th dynasty in Egypt, the great Ebla kingdom, the great palace, and in the southern Levant, EB3, end of EB3. Chronology shifts 200 years. So now the early Bronze IV period is coeval with 4th dynasty, end of the 4th dynasty, and in Syria, Palace G. Okay, so this is why I was talking about a sea change. I think it's monumental, actually. It's changing. It's going to change the history books for sure. So basically, I'm going to be talking about a lot of things, but I hope you can focus on that. It's the new higher chronology and how it has impacted, especially the early Bronze III and the early Bronze IV. So my topic: Levantine Early Bronze Age Reevaluation and New Vistas. So here we are on il Idem, about 100 meters up, a little over 300 feet behind the site. I call it the high place. You can see the whole Wadi al-Wala basin below, King's Highway. I just want you to think about it a little bit. The occupants, of the site could be up there. Trust me, you can see 360 degrees. I climbed that hill many times. I will never climb it again. But you can see all the way to the plateau of Deban. You can see the King's Highway leading to Madaba. It's amazing. And so, of course, you could see armies coming along as well as caravans on the King's Highway. But I would also like to put a little idea in your head about what else is going on here. And maybe this is a clue, this reconstruction. It's landscape. And I will be talking later about cult and ritual and a sacred landscape. A sacred landscape around Kiribati. We'll be talking about high places, the cemeteries, and megalithic structures, and also, standing stones and a variety of things. So anyway, just leave you with that thought for the moment. Hold that thought, and we'll be back to Kiribati. Forgive me for being simplistic. I know everybody knows where the Levant is, but where is it? It's at the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, along the littoral, this whole area. Sometimes the Levant includes Anatolia and Egypt. I think this is probably more accurate here. This area of this satellite photo, maybe modern maps will help better. My colleagues from the north, working in the northern Levant, deal with Syria and Lebanon. I deal with the southern Levant, that is Jordan, Israel, and the Palestinian territories. Although we're working in the southern Levant, I'm very rapidly becoming enmeshed in the northern Levant as well. I think this is one of the best maps I've seen for the outline of what I would call the Levant, from Syria down to the edge of Egypt. So that's the area we're talking about. Okay, this is an outline. I hope to follow it. By the way, this picture I took as I was walking down the hill from El Idem. This is the back of the site. It was kind of a neat shot, I thought. But the outline, some introductory things. Have to talk about that sea change. What does that mean in terms of historical linkages, which I already alluded to a bit. We have to have a little primer, I guess, on radiocarbon 14C Bayesian modeling. Because this is the reason for the shift in chronology. I will talk about how the high chronology impacts the early Bronze Age, the early Bronze III period in the southern Levant, especially, I should have said. But really, the focus, the thrust of my talk, which is on my conclusions for Volume 2, is about the early Bronze IV. And basically, I've talked about this before. I've probably talked about it in my last ACOR talk, but I think the time is ripe now for a reevaluation of the period in light of this new chronology, in light of a lot more excavation materials and new data sets in the archaeological materials, so that I think it's time to put out a new model for the period. I will be talking about complexity in the early Bronze IV period vis-a-vis pastoral nomadism, because forever the period has been known as a pastoral nomadic interlude, and I'll be saying more about that. So really, so I don't keep you in suspense, I'm going to give you my conclusions up front, and it'll be easier to follow the argument, I think. So basically, this is going to be a reevaluation of the early Bronze IV period of the southern Levant. I'm going to suggest that really we need two models. We need rural complexity for the sedentists, which are now emerging as an important component in the population, and pastoral nomadism, rather than trying to negate pastoral nomadism as I've kind of done in the past. I'm talking about two models. And basically, my view, which I'm putting forth in this work and other works, is that this new view of complexity in EB4 resonates so much better now with the new chronology and with the new archaeological data set. So kind of in a nutshell, in summary form, that's what I'm trying to show today. Right. Okay. So the sea change. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. Let's just look at this. I think most of you probably know we're looking at Khephron's pyramid. We're looking at the Sphinx. Probably, about before 2500, or just slightly after, I should say, maybe 2492 ended. And here's Syria, northern Levant. We've got Ebla. I'm sure everybody has heard of Ebla, the kingdom of Ebla, the city that was found like 30 years ago by the Italian team of Sapienza, known for its wealth and its fantastic palace, but especially the archives of thousands of tablets, which introduced us to a new language and a new culture in Western Syria that we thought never existed before. We never had an idea that it existed. So To set the stage, I would just say normally, before the change in the chronology, we would say this is clearly coeval with early Bronze 3 in the southern Levant, and so is Ebla Palestine. Okay, so now I'm going to throw a few dates at you. It's really the transition that is more important. So take a look, as I was saying, this shift has occurred. But first I'm going to give you the traditional dates. And I will explain later more about the EB3 urban period, the time of cities, fortifications, and the early Bronze 4 period, which is a non-urban period. But look at this, 2750 to say 2300 or something like that for the early Bronze 3. So that would work very well here. And early Bronze 4, kind of a short period here, 2350, 2300 to 2000. So really in Dynasty 6, and the first intermediate period, which maybe you have read about, is this period of systemic kind of decline in Egypt between the Old and the New Kingdom, and so it's always been correlated with EB4. Okay, so that's what we thought. Now, the new higher chronology. The new higher chronology, look at these dates for EB3, shifted back about 200 years. So it goes to about 2550, maybe 2500. And EB4, look at that, 2570 or more, down to 1950. So ramifications, significance of this, we really have to rewrite the history books, because now you can see the early Bronze 4 should really be coeval with these two cultures to the south and the north, at least the end of the Dynasty 4 period. And even if these dates shift a little bit, and let's face it, the whole period of the early Bronze Age is now in flux, so there could be some movement there. So even if this particular period in the 4th Dynasty is equal to EB3, still the EB4, at least if not end of Dynasty 4, it's Dynasty 5, Dynasty 6, and the first intermediate period. So think about that. And so rather than there be like a 100-year lag as there was before, here's 2300. It's kind of the end of Ebla because it was destroyed 2300. Well, now it matches it. So really, what I'll be saying to you is early Bronze 3 in the north equals early Bronze 3 in the south. Early Bronze 4 in the north equals early Bronze 4 in the south. And that's what the new chronology has done. A few other points I might make. I think the impact is more stunning for the early Bronze 4 period. Why? Because it starts earlier, for one thing, but it's 600 years. 600 years for this supposed, alleged pastoral nomadic period. So I doubt that we're going to find information from the pastoral nomadic sites to fill that 600 years. No, we have to look to the sedentary sites, to the permanent sites, to the agrarian sites. And I'm going to give you the evidence for that. So I think it's as I say, I think it's monumental. It's really amazing. All right, the Bayesian modeling, just a few words about that. We all know about radiocarbon dating. We've all used it. But what is Bayesian modeling, and how has this changed our ideas on the chronology? First, I would have to point out this was a groundbreaking article, Chronology of the Early Bronze Age in the Southern Levant, New Analysis for a High Chronology. That seems like only yesterday. It was 2012, so you can see how recent all of these changes were. So basically, Bayesian modeling, how is it different from radiocarbon dating itself? So it's a statistical method, Bayesian, and it can put the dates now in a distribution pattern, and so we can get a chronology from it. But how? First of all, one thing now, you really need to have a suite of samples to hand in, or dates, like not one or two, more. You need a number of dates. In fact, what we're looking at here, basically all these dates, I don't even know how many, perhaps hundreds, from the EB1 through the EB4 were all put together, and a model was developed for them, and that's how we get our new chronology. So you need a lot of dates from each site. Good archaeological context. Now, if you're an archaeologist, you know what that means. You mean something that's sealed, or a surface, nothing that's contaminated, of course, not from film. In fact, we were able to send in some dates, some samples from seas that were in a pot that was on a surface, which was perfect. So good archaeological context is what you need. And this, I think, is the big one. You have to know the sequence. And this is really different from before. Before, we handed in samples, and random samples, and we got back random, kinds of dates, and averages were taken, kind of a scatter of dates. But now, the archaeologist is handing in not just the samples, but handing in the sequence, knowing, like, this is from phase 1, phase 2, phase 4, phase 5. So before, we didn't have that, and as I found out, the computer wasn't able to figure out what was first and what was last. But now, working with archaeologists and including this kind of information in the modeling, they're able to come up with these wonderful distributions. So I would just reiterate, knowing the archaeological sequence is key, and here's a great example. Our colleagues digging at the EB4 site of Tel Abu-Niaj in the Jordan Valley, this just came out a couple months ago. This is a dream site, really. I'm quite envious. They've got 7 phases for EB4, and not only that, they've got carbon samples from each phase. Now, that is really amazing. And so, look at this chart. So, you've got, I can see this, phase 7 is the earliest, phase 1 is the latest, and they know what's in between. So that information would have been submitted along with the samples. So really, the computer then can do its magic and give us this distribution from early to late. And so this is a great site. I want to point out the dates I had mentioned earlier. I mean, it may push back EB4 even to about 2600. It's certainly at least 2550. And it ends, like I said, around 2000, maybe 1950. I mean, it's the whole 600-year period. So we do have sites that can start to fill the gaps in our knowledge about the early Bronze 4 period. I mean, we have dates also of 2550. At Khirbet Iskander, we thought they were outliers long ago because they were too early. Now we know they're absolutely perfect. So we think we have, probably Khirbet Iskander is occupied from the earliest part of EB4 to the end as well. I think just for your interest, you might note you can see gray, if you can, I don't know if you can see the gray curves, which represent the individual dates or samples, and then the black ones are the modeled samples. But for example, I was looking at this and I was noticing that here, phase 7, the gray, is not too unlike the one here for phase 5. So in the old way of doing things without Bayesian modeling and statistical modeling, you wouldn't know where to put those. You would not be able to put it into a distribution. So now, that's the beauty of this Bayesian modeling. So Bayesian modeling, all of these new factors have given us the new chronology. Right. I would be remiss without mentioning arcane. Sorry about the map. The chart is a little overwhelming even to me. But the associated regional chronologies for the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean at 3rd millennium BC. This was a Herculean task to correlate the entire Middle East and the Mediterranean. I mean, from Cyprus to WI, Western Iran, and everything in between. And, how they did this, I'm not sure, but we only need to be concerned with the southern Levant, and southern Levant, and this would be the northern Levant here. the terminology has changed a bit. They put these in E, so for early bronze. But the main thing is what I said before, EB3 in the southern Levant now equals EB3. Well, these are the two phases in Syria. And here's Ebla, Palestine, EB4A, that equals EB4 in the southern Levant, and EB4B equals EB4. It's nice. It's wonderful. It solves a lot of problems, and I guess that's what I'm going to be pointing out as we go along. Great. Okay, so early Bronze Age. Well, just tried to sum it up a little bit for you. Again, more dates. Sorry, but the traditional dates, 3600 to 2000, but the new chronology, now it's more like 3900 to 1950. It's like 2,000 years. That's an awfully long time for one civilization, one culture, early Bronze Age. But we see in it, this is the first urban period. Also throughout the Near East, earlier and more advanced, of course, in Mesopotamia. But we have our first urban period. You could talk about the rise and fall of urban or city life with EB1, the rise, early Bronze 2, 3, kind of the peak of cities and urbanization. But then in the southern Levant, to a little degree in the north, but it's different. There's destruction, abandonment of the tells. Some people call it a collapse. I used to, but now I'm getting away from the term collapse, mainly because there's an immediate regeneration of life. You saw it at Niage starting 2550 or 2600. And so newer theoretical views of scholars kind of viewing collapse as sort of catastrophic, with nothing remaining, no continuity whatsoever. And unless we consider everybody died at the end of EB3, for which there's no evidence, it's highly unlikely. So as in Syria, I think we should start talking about regeneration. So that's what we see. We don't see urbanism in the southern Levant, but we see like a low level type of village life and with some urban features, and that's what I'm going to be talking about, as well as pastoral nomadism. In Syria, some places also are abandoned, but most sort of recover and urbanism continues. So it's a little different between Syria and the southern Levant. So anyway, we'll be saying more and looking at the culture and the traditions, but overall, it's kind of a view of the early Bronze Age. And I've said before that the early Bronze 4 has really been called a pastoral nomadic period for a very long time. One slide says it all. You do not need to be a pottery expert to see that the early Bronze 3 of the northern Levant matches the early Bronze 3 of the southern Levant, and the early Bronze 4A of the north matches the south, and the early Bronze 4B matches the south, so perfect. Just note a few things. Before, this period was equal to early Bronze 3, and I'm here to tell you, and I think others could affirm this, there's not one sherd of any type of this fantastic new dominant culture from Syria in EB3. But it is in EB4, so it makes perfect sense. So that's one thing. Another thing I wanted to mention is that if you look closely, you can see that they're not identical. And that means these are not imports, these are not imports, but they're local imitations. And pretty sophisticated pottery, manufacturing, and production, and we'll be talking about that. So this early Bronze 4 period is becoming, connected with more complexity than previously. Okay, so the cultures are in sync. I'm not saying that the entire assemblage in the north matches the south, but for the most part, the two are in sync. Right, so I guess this is maybe my third part of my outline. I'm talking about some of the key ways in which the higher chronology has impacted our knowledge and understanding of the early Bronze III period, one of which, probably the most important of which you might think is what happened to all those cities about 2550, 2500, that were abandoned, destroyed. I know I definitely used this slide for my ACOR talk in 2008. These are the same culprits, if you will, but today I think we have more information. I think we can speak more knowledgeably about it. Indeed, I think we can now eliminate some as causes for the collapse or the fall of the urban cities. So let's think about Egyptian raids. Previously, some of these, there are reliefs and there are texts talking about Egyptians laying siege against cities or forts, and also going against the sand dwellers, and still today nobody knows who they're referring to. But that's not the main idea here. The main idea, it's the 5th dynasty, and it's far too late. That's what I'm going to say about all of these. Remember, the early Bronze IV period now starts around 2550, 2500. So it could not have been the Egyptians, and these are all 5th dynasty, 6th dynasty texts. So I think we can eliminate the Egyptians coming in and the wholesale destruction of the country, not to say there might not have been some raids. Amorites. The Amorites from Mesopotamia and Syria. Again, I would say the same thing. Too late. We hear about them. They're even mentioned in the Ebla text, but they're not a force to contend with yet. It's toward the end of the 3rd millennium, like 2300, 2100, that they're moving toward they're moving toward Mesopotamia. And then later, they will be moving into Egypt. This is about 1932, I guess. So it's Middle Bronze Age. It's from the 2nd millennium. So again, I'm thinking that it could not have been Amorites who are said to have overrun the country. It's too late. Now, what about climate? Okay, we have to talk about the 4.2 KYRBP event. Oh, I should have changed this date, which really is more like 2200. One person wants to shift it to 2350, but 2200. So again, might have been a sort of a global event of drought found in northern Mesopotamia, maybe the reason for the first intermediate period, and the collapse of the Old Kingdom. So this should be more like 2200. But again, not to say that climate isn't a factor, other sites at other times regionally, but this is too late for the end of the cities in 2550. What else? Earthquakes. Now this has become more popular. And it's true, we have evidence for earthquakes in EB2, EB3, even at Kiribati-Skandu, we can see the cracks in the fortifications. Maybe, but again, wholesale destruction of the country, it sounds unrealistic. So what did happen? Well, that's a good question. I don't think we can answer that. We can say what it probably wasn't. Of course, a lot of scholars simply say it's a combination of things, which it could be. I would just like to know one thing, though, that could be a factor, and that is in EB3, we no longer have any imports from Egypt. And why is that important? It's important because now Egypt is trading with Byblos along the seacoast. So picture that. They're not going through the country, over the land. And what might that do to the economy of a country that's really maybe dependent on this trade? Perhaps there are great stores of food that would normally be traded with Egypt or whatever. So I think perhaps, maybe the system was weakened by this, and it could have been other things happening that finally, ultimately brought urbanism to an end. We really don't know. yet. But one thing that's interesting, again, is that, consider this, now you have the rise of Ebla Empire in the north, and you've got, a powerful country in the south, Egypt. It kind of makes sense with this rural period in the early Bronze Four. With maybe the southern Levant sort of being in this asymmetric kind of relationship. It's like a core periphery kind of relationship with the north. So anyway, trying to make sense of all the different factors, but it is interesting that talking about the new chronology, it really it makes sense now why there are no more imports after the Fourth Dynasty, because it's the EB4 period. It's not the EB3 period anymore. Anyway, moving on then to the early Bronze Age, the early Bronze 3. In just a few slides, I hope to sort of give you an idea of what urbanism in the southern Levant looks like. It's not the urbanism of Mesopotamia or Syria, and I know there are others who don't think it's urban at all. So I'm just going to sidestep that scholarly controversy. I think it's urban. I think it's a small-scale type of urbanism. So with, the fortifications, the palaces, palatial buildings, temples, and international trade, and everything that goes with a very highly complex society. So we are looking at Betrari, the palace area with some very elite copper weapons found there, and Saadia area. And basically, I just saw these online a couple days ago, and I had to include them. It's from the Haran, northern Jordan, the Desert Noir, the Black Desert, this inhabitable, one thought, inhospitable, terra incognita place. But now fortified sites have been found there, a number of them. And early, like the mid-4th millennium, they might be the earliest fortified sites anywhere. So I'm just saying we're not equal, southern Levant, to the advanced cultures to the north in all sorts of ways, but really we're pretty much, there's no lag in fortifications or the beginning of cities or etc. I would point out there are glimpses, bits and pieces of the astonishing sites that are in the north. This is Yarmouth, west of the Jordan, and it is a true palace, which is equal to any palace in northern Syria. So there are little bits and pieces, like I say, of examples of real urbanism in the country. So we could talk about temples, lots of temples. I just show a few. Of course, Zerkun, a wonderful sacred area, and I'm especially looking at these outdoor altars, these wonderful sacrificial areas. This is the famous one at Megiddo. One was found at Betrari. You can see, I think there's one at Baba Dra. There's a simple, perhaps southern Levant type of broadroom temple, but nevertheless, there's evidence for kind of a homogeneous type of cult or religion throughout the country, which probably is not dissimilar from Syria. I might point out, its reproduction helps you to see. I'm going to be talking about betels, and here's a betel, or a standing stone, or this is like a pole that's been put into a pivot there. So again, the palatial buildings, we have them, and again, Zerkun, it's amazing the fortifications in the early Bronze 3. There's something like 19 phases at Zerkun. There's an upper city, a lower city. I like to point out Arad, because when we'll begin looking at early Bronze 4 sites, and a side view of mine that I won't go into too much is that the culture really is indigenous and comes from the early Bronze 3, as well as there being influences from Syria, but the same arrangement of little houses around courtyards. We're going to see them in EB4. This is Kiribati-Skander. Just to point out that small site, Kiribati-Skander, we have at least 3 major fortifications, rebuilds, and many more phases, and it's maybe an 8-acre site. So the small sites and the large sites, they all kind of have the same culture of the early Bronze Age. So I think we can kind of understand urbanism better because of the new chronology as well, because people used to say, well, we have that big palace of Yarmouth and all of these wonderful things in EB3 because it's a time of the Ebla Palace, gee. But no, it's before the time of the Palace G. So it's kind of interesting. So we'll have to see how these things work out in future. So I'm just trying to point out a few ideas as we go along. Okay, so I am now getting to EB4 finally. And I am going to be talking a little bit about a chart that Deaver published. In fact, I'm just kind of segueing from urbanism in the early Bronze 3 to my main thesis is that there are urban-like features in the early Bronze 4. And that's what I'm going to be talking about. I have to laugh every time I see this because there's no consensus of opinion today on the end of the early Bronze Age. And I was, a PhD student, what do I know? So I was talking about consensus back then. But these new vistas, this I have to say is a view of EB4 that is still prevalent today. Pastoral nomadism. Oh, I hope you could see pastoral nomadism perspective in 1980. This says it all. Here's the view of early Bronze 4. In relation to urban features, and what he's doing basically is saying there are none. There are no urban features in the early Bronze 4. You have them in early Bronze 2, 3, nothing in early Bronze 4, like no trade, no religion, no art, no advanced technology, no complex society, monumental architecture, none, defenses, no. Sites aren't built up, secondary, not nucleated, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, that is pretty good for pastoral nomadism, but not for the sedentary peoples. And I'm here to tell you that there are fortifications, nucleated settlements, a great deal of architecture, a lot of continuity and phasing. There's monumental architecture, cultic and ritual evidence, technology, horticulture, agriculture. I've gone through them all, even art. There's some evidence. Thanks to more excavation and, like I said, new data sets. And I think, the new chronology, connecting it with EB4 in the north helps tremendously too. So I've made a case elsewhere for rural complexity in this period, which basically means that I'm dividing. What I'm doing is showing that the early Bronze 4 society is far more diverse than most people would think. If somebody says to you, okay, it's a pastoral nomadic period, what are you thinking? It's mobile, it's semi-sedentary, there's no permanence. It just clouds your vision of the archaeological remains. It distorts our view of the period. So I'm here to make a case for the sedentists, and indeed what I want to do next in the time that remains. I'm basically going to take some of those features, those urban features, and I'm going to try to show you how we have them in EB4. I'll start with Kiribati-Skander usually, and then I'll show comparative material from other sites. But first, I will talk about pastoral nomadism, just this one slide. I do not want to slight the pastoral nomads. Their system of subsistence is complex, and they're just extremely well adapted. Their strategies to arid zones. to herding, to transhumance, to their, even trade. So I'm simply trying to contrast that lifestyle with what I'll be showing you, which is the permanent settlements, like Niage and like Kiribati and other settlements. And it just bothers me that people at Kiribati or Niage are called pastoral nomads. It's just not correct. It's not accurate. So I'm using one site, which is emblematic of these number of pastoral nomadic sites in the Negev. It's Bir Essasim. And you can see there are a number of these round structures on the site. And here they are. They're small, round huts, 1 meter high roof. You couldn't do much in these, maybe sleep, maybe a little bit of work. They have found not a lot of evidence for grinding grain, but some. So they could be grinding grain, and maybe they're even putting in a crop. Seasonally, one doesn't know, but not a lot of evidence for that has been found. But I am going to be contrasting architecture and the lack of, material culture for art and various things. I'll be contrasting, the permanent sites with these pastoral nomadic sites. So I'm not going to say that much more about pastoral nomads. It's another lecture. I'm just going to use, the evidence from the permanent sites, as I said, to contrast with these particular semi-sedentary, sites which have one real thin layer of occupation. So there's no continuity there, not a lot of occupation. And there are a number of sites, and they all look like this, homogeneous, maybe they're egalitarian. But anyway, let's take a look at the permanent sites. And we'll be talking first about Kiribati. There are many more permanent sites, but these are just a few that were mentioned in a text I wrote. This is from 1990, and these lists the sites that have been found, not just excavated, but surveyed. But today, I think we could double those. We really need a new map to show all the sites that have been found through survey for the early Bronze 4 period. So it's not true that there aren't very many early Bronze 4 sites. And just a 3D image of the Kiribati and its surroundings, as you can see. Here's the site. There's El Idem. The King's High will be over here. Kind of gives you, there's a Wadi Walla, very important. So it gives you an idea of the topography of the area. But let's take a look, thanks to our colleagues at Apame. We can see the site in its overall setting. As I said, I was standing up at El Idem, and I could see the road going to Madaba, coming down over the bridge, and then going up to Deban, the plateau. This area is under cultivation now, but it used to be a lower mound, covered with megaliths. And Nelson Glick had said, it's a fantastic sacred site. It must have been a great site, talking about sacred landscape. So here's the site. There are cemeteries all around. Okay, so basically I'm going to take some of those categories from that chart to show you what evidence there is, or as much of it as I can. Here's a view of Kiribati and that mound to the east from 1939, when Nelson Glick was there surveying the area, and you can already see the fortifications. And in fact, he saw, and he was able to find early Bronze 4 buildings built against the fortifications. So we've known for a long time that this was a fortified site in the early Bronze 4 period. And you can see some of these megaliths there. So today, we have put together the fortifications. We need to add the new fortification up there. But essentially, we have been able to show what Nelson Glick originally saw back in 1939, that indeed there are fortifications. We have a gate, which we published in Volume 1, and now we're working on Area B, which is Volume 2. And I will get back to some of those cultic megalithic materials. But as for fortifications, some people don't accept the fact that there could be fortifications in EB4, but we have lots of evidence, and recently we found a link, an EB4 Phase B wall intersecting the fortification, and it's kind of a casemate affair here. So we're positive that there are fortifications at Kirbet Iskander, but recently at Tel Hammam, huge site, continuity from EB beyond and MB and beyond. But he has found a lot of early Bronze 4 occupation there, and he does talk about the early Bronze 4 materials and monumental materials being inside fortifications, and that this gate was blocked by the early Bronze 4 people. So new evidence coming out to show this. What does this mean, fortifications? It means a lot of energy output, organization. It infers some leadership, some social distinctions. There's a lot we can say about the society based on this. So that's why it's so important. So it talks about, something that's complex. We would be talking complexity in the urban period. So here's a site not too far from Niaj, Al Mara, Darat Al Mara, which has like a 2 to 4 meter wide fortification with a public building, again, which is monumentality on the site. Across the river, almost opposite this site, again, an early Bronze 4 site found with fortifications, my TA. And this is interesting because in the vicinity of this site, they found 40 EB4 sites from survey. So again, in the future, I think we're just going to find more and more evidence from the permanent sites. We need more of these to be excavated, however. And in fact, from survey, there are a number of sites I could have added to this where there are fortifications. So I'm trying to make the point, fortifications infers type of complexity in the period. And pastoral nomads, it would be an anathema, or I should say antithetical to the pastoral nomadic lifestyle, which is mobile and temporary, to spend all that energy building these huge fortifications. So throw up a number of pictures of some of the sites. I'm trying to show, unlike that chart that said there's no town planning, no built-up sites, no complexity whatsoever. Well, there is. And this is one phase at Kirbet Iskander. And again, I was talking about those typical early Bronze 2-3 arrangements of buildings around courtyards. Obviously, we're talking about extended families. And maybe some families are more important than other families with these big houses. Remember those round huts for the pastoral nomads in the Negev. I'll talk about this as a public building. I call it a public building from Kirbet Iskander, and I'm going to talk about it in a little bit. We have a gateway, monumental, huge, nice entrance, big steps going into the town. It's unique, by the way. And other things, just to give you an idea, Kirbet Iskander has some of the best preserved EB4 architecture anywhere. I mean, big, huge buildings. So note the contrast with the pastoral nomads. I'm just going to throw these up quickly to show, yes, there is town planning. I mean, back to Niaj, they've got paved streets, and they've got a wonderful arrangement of houses on both sides. You can see the street. Obviously, there's some pre-planning going into this. Iktanu, and some sites, this site, Char Galon, is 20 hectares. And again, as before in EB23, you've got clusters of an arrangement of different sizes of buildings around courtyards, and I hope you see the contrast with the pastoral nomadic type of settlement plan. So definitely diversified neighborhoods, nucleated, and this building here, I'm going to talk about in terms of, storage and the cult. We found so much material in it. It can't be a domestic building with some 150 whole and restored vessels, lots of storage jars, but I'm going through like hundreds of diagnostics. I don't know where they put all this pottery in that building, tell you the truth. But you could see huge, that must have been shells, or it had to be on the roof, but huge pithoi vats, and 83 liters, we measured it for that. So really, I think it's a storeroom, and you don't normally have storerooms in a pastoral nomadic period. So it's, whether it's for distribution, whether it's for, I think there's some ritual going on, or whether it's for trade. They're on the King's Highway, remember? We don't know, but definitely it's not domestic. I've pointed out before that it's not the pastoral sites that are going to help us fill 600 years. We have to look to the permanent sites. And so we're seeing phasing in the development that I was talking about. Kiribati-Skander, I talked about it in Volume 1. We have 3 clear superimposed architectural phases, and I talk about recovery and growth and stability. And again, it's all the phases at these other sites, Tel Abu Na'ash and other sites. Most sites have 1 to 2 phases. So I think we'll have enough occupation to, see about the entire period as well. But what I want to point out here, I'll have an opportunity finally to show something from our dig this summer, because what we did, which was kind of interesting, is that although we had finished this excavation, we published it in Volume 1, and we restored it. We decided, because there's so much interest in the field now about this early phasing and the early part of the EB4, we decided to go back and try for more exposure, which we did. And we found out a number of things. It's really fascinating. So we, got more surface materials, which will help us. We were trying to get into earlier EB3 material, but it was only a 4-week session, but we were highly successful in finding more material. In fact, that same wall, we found it up we opened a square to the north, and it's a large building, and so we're just going to have more exposure at Kiribati-Skander, at the eastern end of the gate of early bronze for A, B, and C. So that'll be coming out soon. So that was kind of a wonderful thing to happen this past summer. We didn't know if we find anything. So along with phasing, which of course has to come from the sedentary sites with continuous occupation, we did a quantitative study of the pottery, the ceramics, and we were able to show statistically that 3 ceramic phases matched our 3 architectural phases. And that's really important because most people think that the pottery is homogeneous. There's no phasing in EB4. No, there is phasing in EB4, and we have the proof for it, and I'm sure can't wait till we see the pottery from Niage. But what we were able to do, and I think it was innovative, we used shared databases with Babadra, and we were able to match our phasing with their phasing, our ceramics with their ceramics. So we really were able to correlate central site on the Transjordanian Plateau with a southern site, Babadra, which was a fantastic thing to do. And in fact, hopefully we can move on and maybe try to pull in Niage. And again, there's so many things to say about the period that I probably have neglected to say. One of the reasons people thought it was nomadic way back when is that they found isolated cemeteries, and that somehow these cemeteries had nothing to do with sites, but that was totally wrong. And in fact, most cemeteries now are found to be next to sites. So what we found indeed is that the culture of the living is very similar, if not identical, to the culture of the dead. Both these assemblages of vessels, except for lamps, and you would expect more lamps in tombs, but basically they were the same. And I've sort of talked about it in Volume 1, talked about an ideology of house and home and the tomb, and how they're closely related. And we know that even in the early Bronze Age, because houses look the same as temples, look the same as tombs, so we know there's a good connection there. But I was able to show cemeteries surrounding Kiribati-Skander and the megaliths I'll show you in a moment, and the high place that I talked about. Really, I talked about an ideology of ancestor worship. And I talked about how it definitely reflects a sacred landscape. Most people would agree that megaliths, standing stones, reflect an ancestor cult. So we were able to do an innovative study, really, of the tombs and the site, and talking about megaliths. And this is what Nelson Glick would have seen. We've been able to excavate some of it, but most of it's now under plow. It's been planted now. We'll never get back to it. But he found menhir, standing stones. He found all kinds of sanctuaries. And there's the high place again. So indeed, there was this huge area of megaliths to the east of the site. We excavated some. I'd like to point out we found sealed early Bronze IV pottery in one of them. So this Kyrgyzstan had to have been a regional site where people would come from maybe all over for special occasions, perhaps in memory of the ancestors. Very important ideology in the ancient Near East, and there's plenty of evidence for it. So again, that's what I was kind of thinking about when we talked about the high place and thinking about a sacred landscape. Maybe when you go to Kyrgyzstan and look at it, we today miss it totally, but it's very symbolic. It would have been very symbolic to the people living at the site and others. So I had mentioned this site. I'll just move quickly here. Mentioned the public building for all sorts of reasons, the storeroom, but also the very unusual materials that were found in it. And I recently published this. Basically, I think you can develop a case for ritual and religion based on the remains. These are miniatures. These are so unusual. No other site has all of these miniatures, and in fact, a small little jug and a tiny little cup found right on that platform there next to cup marks. Could have been used for libations, but it's quite amazing. I really don't know anything like it. And so in the context, I think we can talk about some kind of ritual. Indeed, all of the miniatures had to do with liquids. So they were cups, they were teapots, and they were jugs. And at Ebla, indeed, it has been noticed that combination reflects this probably, ritual drinking, these particular vessels. And these are miniatures, might be a type of thing we call competitive emulation, which, here we are in the southern Levant, the elites are at Ebla and throughout Syria, and so to kind of imitate them, you utilize the same assemblage. So kind of developed that idea. But other things we found, food offerings, and this is one of these huge vessels, and it's really fantastic, plastered, bin with the cup marks. So it really is a wonderful, wonderful building. I think it's a public building. Just want to mention a few little things further about ritual, cult, religion, and art. I'm trying to go through the list, but notice this. We recently found a Kyrgyzstan. It's a round, structure, a platform of stone with a pillar, incised, with a table, an offering table, maybe for sacrifices. It now helps us to understand the Babadra, famous Babadra, EB4 cult site. Again, round, as you can see, stones, and a big, platforms for some kind of sacrifices. So again, with more and more excavation, we're finding evidence for ritual and cult. I would note at Ein Hilu, to the west of the Jordan, and Rephaim and other sites are now finding these betels I had mentioned earlier. We've got a number of them at Kyrgyzstan too that I'm not even showing. This is a fantastic site, Al Rauda, in Syria. It's a rural, urban site in the Syrian desert. And take a look at this again. There are connections, there's no doubt about it, with Syria. Here you have this round feature, huge standing stone. And it's an outdoor altar like these, but it's inside a room. And it's part of this grand sanctuary with a temple at one end. So again, look at these comparisons, and it's hard to deny that, this is evidence of a cult and maybe similar cult as in Syria. There's not a lot of art, but there's some. We found a couple. Peter Parr found that one. We found a zoomorphic figurine. This is well known from Ain Samia. It's a silver cup with a Mesopotamian mythological scene. You had to be an elite to have such a cup given to you for your burial or buried with you. So it raises all kinds of ideas about elites and social distinctions and interconnectivity and silver. This just again from Gibeon, just a kind of a relief of, it looks like an ibex, which is such a popular and cultic scene we find in the north. So I think probably religious as well. It's a frieze going around a pot. I would just mention this is unpublished. It's from Curva to Scander. I hope you can see what it is. It's a spout of a teapot sideways. And I think you maybe can see these arms. And if you could see the back, you could see arms, like arms coming all the way around. And what does that look like? It's clearly a goddess, a mother goddess, or some kind of evidence for fertility object. And the only other one was found at Kakir in the west, to the west of the Jordan. There are these stick figurines that have the arms like this. It's such a well-known motif throughout the Aegean. And you can see they've been paralleled with Syrian fertility figurines. So you can see the arms, and these are mother goddess figurines. So we have what I think some evidence for that, and that also comes from the public building. And I would just point out one last thing, and that is we have a number of these jugs that have two nipples opposite the handle, and they're so popular. I could show hundreds in the Aegean. Again, pars pro toto of the mother goddess throughout the Mediterranean. So there is evidence of cult, fertility cult. I developed a case for an ancestor cult. So again, but the best evidence so far is the redating of the Megiddo temple. This is a real temple, the only one in the period, and the current excavators, Adams and Ushishkin, follow Kenyon's date of EB4 for this temple, and note the altar. It's a very controversial sacred area at Megiddo. But anyway, just to point out an actual temple, and I've always thought it was a temple. It was early bronze 4 axe head found in the wall. And I don't show you the pottery, but the pottery is definitely EB4, which they found in the foundation levels. So lots of evidence. Obviously, Megiddo was a regional site. A central site. I hardly have to say anything about the Feinan, the huge copper industry in the south of Jordan. We have every aspect there, the mining, the production, the distribution. It's EB3, EB4 at the site of Kibbutz Hamar Ifdan. And note they have the remains of molds for ingots. And these ingots have been found at various places in the Negev. It's lately has been found in the north at Housedoor. So again, trade networks and resources in copper, and not just copper, tin bronze. This is a unique little spearhead from Kirba to Skander, and it's tin bronze, and tin bronze normally is connected with the Middle Bronze Age. So a new technology, so obviously new trade routes for resources of tin being brought from the north. So I guess I'm just, piling it up on you. I'm trying to overwhelm you with all this data for complexity in the period. And I could just very quickly talk about specialization, pottery, production, and distribution. Now it's clear that we have at least 3 major centers for fine ware, trickle painted ware, And also, this is what I was showing you earlier, similar to the Syrian pottery, but not imported. I mean, it's a beautiful ware. It's highly skilled in firing techniques to get this black ware, and then it's painted white, and then, sometimes inside, so it's a black on white reserved effect. It's highly sophisticated. In the north, they found distribution centers, production probably at Housedoor, and even these vessels it's so distinctive. We've got a number of them at Iskander from the Amman region, but we find them at Khirbet Iskander. They have these wonderful pot marks on them. Again, is it a product that's being exported? So we do have good evidence for a lot of sophistication. Getting to the end here, just want to point out, in Khirbet Iskander, we have all of these vessels that most agree have to do with olive oil production, the crushing vats, the decanters, these huge vessels with spouts, and of course the huge pithos for storage. And kind of like to point out other things. I can't say everything, but if it's a permanent site, you would have, or I should put it the other way, if it's a pastoral nomadic site, you're not going to have pig and cattle. You don't, there's no transhumance with pig and cattle, but with sheep and goat. So we're trying to show you that Niage and these various sites in the Jordan Valley are permanent, and really a comparison between an early Bronze 4 site like Niage is not any different from a rural site, Hayat in the Middle Bronze Age. So basically just trying to make the point that ruralism, rural sites, whether it's in an urban period, non-urban period, one can make a case for it in the early Bronze 4 period. And finally, I would want to talk about climate just for a second from Khirbet Iskander, because I mentioned it earlier. And actually, we do have evidence for that 42K event. We've had work done, geomorphological work and archaeological studies of pollen, cores, and basically by Carlos Cordova, and basically able to show floodplain throughout the early Bronze Age, but around 2500, what begins to happen: irregular ponding and erosion to the floodplain. So that kind of fits with end of EB3, yet it wasn't so drastic that life couldn't continue, and it did at at the EB4 juncture. And you can see we have olive, wheat, barley, lentil, grape, fig, again, sheep, goats, cattle, and pig. So basically, early Bronze 4 Khirbet Iskander could continue, but it got worse and worse, and finally the site was totally abandoned at 2000. There was no way to live there any longer because of the erosion. And it was never occupied again. So basically, a lot of information. Tried to put some conclusions together, so it might make it a little easier to see all those sites and the material culture and context. But what I've been trying to say is that the new higher chronology, based on Bayesian modeling, links EB3, EB4 of the northern and southern Levant nicely, and it's due to a 200-year shift in dates, as I said. I've been talking about the early Bronze 4 is a 600-year period with now an important sedentary component emerging, and I hope I've convinced you that, these are not pastoral nomads in those sites, and soon we'll be able to talk about chronology throughout that period. Khirbet Iskander and other early Bronze 4 permanent sites reflect a type of rural complexity in contrast to the pastoral nomadic evidences. And I've proposed that there should be two models to grasp the diverse nature of EB4 society. I'm agreeing there are pastoral nomads out there, but I'm not agreeing that the people who live in these permanent sites are pastoral nomads. So I've developed this idea of a rural complexity to cover this other component of the society. So there's the site, and thank you very much.